Hello, everybody. My name is Ali Velshi. I'm the host of a show that airs every night on Al Jazeera America. It's called Real Money with Ali Velshi. Unfortunately, Al Jazeera is a new channel. It's only been around for about a year in the United States. It's still a few years away from being here in Canada, but I hope when it is, you'll all be able to see what I do. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight. I want to thank Suncor for doing this. I think it's courageous, given that you have no idea what everybody's going to say. There's a little booklet that Suncor's got out on the table there. You should take a look at it. It's questions about oil sands. And it's quite comprehensive. It's got pictures and charts, which always help with this sort of thing. If you're looking for my advice, and nobody has asked for it, I had to get about 90% of the way through before I saw a reference to greenhouse gases. That is the only conversation about oil sands right now. And if you don't think it is, you're just wrong. That has to be in the front. I commend you for doing it, but that's what this is about right now. This conversation, we get it. We get the economics of it. We get the national security. We get all of it. I have parts of me on both sides of this border, and I get all of the nuances and the details and the conversations now about the environment. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk to you about my clothes. They're brand new. I landed from New York this morning, went right to the hotel, opened up my bag, and I was so crazy about how light I travel. There was no suit in it. I've been on the road for a few days. I'm going to be on the road for a couple more weeks, and I made the mistake of flying home for a night and staying in my apartment in New York, take a little break from all the travel. That was a big mistake. I got soft. I rested up, got up this morning nice and early, threw on jeans and a nice cotton shirt, not the type that you're wearing. I mean, this is not the kind of stuff you can show up anywhere, and yours is good. And I headed to the airport, again, thinking about how nobody travels as well as I do. Anyway, thanks to the good folks at Harry Rosen over at the Rideau Center, I'm suitably turned out to speak to you. That was the second time I've been home in a couple weeks. The last time I was home was a week ago Sunday. Now, I live on the Upper West Side in New York. Now, in late summer, on a Sunday afternoon in the Upper West Side, it usually means there's a street fair going on, and families and runners and dogs are streaming in and out of Central Park. Everybody's having a great time. But this was a little bit different. Sunday, September 21st, there were an extra 400,000 people in my neighborhood. They were rallying about climate change. And as I wove my way up, I take the train in, and I wove my way up Manhattan from Penn Station up to the Upper West Side. And I cover a lot of rallies and protests in my job. I go to G20s and G6s and G9, whatever they are. I go to all of them. I've seen every kind of rally there is. These were not the sorts of people that I normally see at these rallies. But we reported on it. And the next day I interviewed Valerie Rockefeller Wayne, who heads the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and it had just decided to head toward full divestment of fossil fuels. Then I interviewed the World Bank President, Jim Kim. It was a very busy week in New York, as you know. It was United Nations General Assembly. And he told me about a deal that the bank had helped broker between 73 countries and 1,000 companies to figure out how to price carbon. It's not all that complicated. It's just you actually have to get a lot of agreement. Then I met up with a guy named David Crane. You may or may not know his name. He's a heretic. He's a CEO of a company called NRG. It's an electrical utility in the United States, but a lot of people in the industry kind of hate him because he's kind of, he says these things that you're not supposed to say when you're a utility guy. He was actually at the rally with his family, which speaks to the idea that there are people who went to this rally who never go to marches. They just don't do that kind of thing. And then I covered the UN Climate Summit. So I spent a lot of time last week thinking about the climate. And obviously, when you think about the climate, you have to think about energy. And I got a sense that this time it's a little bit different. This time, maybe the deniers and their lobbyists weren't going to have the last laugh. People seem to have had it up to here somehow with not just climate change, because we don't know everything there is to know about climate change, but we do seem to be frustrated with the indifference and sometimes the outright lies put forward by companies and legislators and lobbyists. And I think they just were sending a message that we've got to do something. However, While I was busy thinking about how everything is different, the truth is everything is different until you start to put a price on it, which is why I was interested in how the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is going to replace the fantastic returns that the energy sector has given people who invest, or how the World Bank is going to go about gaining agreement on carbon pricing models, because when you're rich, you can do certain things differently than when you're poor and you're developing out your energy infrastructure. And that tree-hugging CEO, David Crane from NRG, in the true spirit of environmentalism, have a future without electricity generated by coal. But it can't have a future without coal and without natural gas. And then that sort of sinks in, that now you're making decisions between things. An election is upon us in the United States. Just before the last election, which was 2 years ago, I used to be at CNN, and I used to ride around on this bus that CNN had. I would just go across the country and talk to people and get paid for it. It was fascinating. I was in Youngstown, Ohio, which is, it really exemplifies the Rust Belt. In its heyday, it was a booming town. It's about 100 kilometers, a little more than that, from Pittsburgh. Youngstown had steel plants and it had auto. But then steel went away, and the auto plants idled. And what the closure of the steel and the auto plants didn't kill, the recession finished off. This was a town that was all but left for dead until they found natural gas. Youngstown sits on the Marcellus Shale Formation. Unemployment today in Youngstown is about 8%. It's a little higher than the state average. It's higher than the national average, too. But this was a place that had double-digit unemployment. The place is starting to boom because of natural gas. It's also starting to shake. They've... Come on, that was good. They've recorded more than a dozen earthquakes and pretty definitively linked them to fracking operations, largely because there weren't any quakes before there was fracking, and then they stopped the fracking and the quakes stopped. And then they started the fracking again and the quakes started. I'm no geologist, I'm just saying. So I went there, and I'm talking to people about this, and the folks in Youngstown told me they would take the shaking along with the boom because they needed the money. Now, needing the money is tied to people needing the energy. And needing the energy makes us make decisions that we otherwise might not have made. All those pipelines in Europe that they're depending on, because they're carrying that natural gas from Russia through Ukraine. In 1981, Ronald Reagan warned Europe that they didn't really need that gas and that they would become dependent on it, and an expansionist Soviet Union would ultimately use it as leverage. Nobody believed him then. They believed him substantially less when the wall came down. And it sounded a lot like a lot of stuff Ronald Reagan said, so, you know, sure, yeah, Soviet Union. However, Europeans are now in it. They are entirely dependent on this natural gas that comes from Russia. They don't really have an alternative at the moment. Their economies were slowing before all this stuff with Russia started. And in places like Germany and Italy, they're dependent on it not just to heat their homes and buildings, but for their electricity production, their industrial production. But they're still saying no to fracking, even though much of Europe sits above shale formations. Priorities are different in Europe. The environment does come first, even when national security is at risk. But on the hierarchy of fear, national security sits just a little lower than existential threat. And on this very day, I'm a business reporter, so I follow markets. Stock markets around the world tumbled. Because there are people around the world who are now beginning to think in terms of existential threat, not national security. There's enough going on in the world. I'm not even talking about climate, by the way. There are a lot of people who think global warming is the existential threat, and they could be right, but I'm talking about sort of slightly more immediate existential threats. The type of, and the way to think about this is, if any of you are old enough to sort of remember, maybe as Canadians you won't remember it, but if you knew Americans, you'd know the kind of fear that Americans of Reagan's vintage had about the Soviet Union. Real existential threat. Sometimes in Canada we look at that and say, why were they so nuts about that? Why is it when you walk around American cities there are nuclear shelters all over the place? Because they really actually were scared. And there are people getting that scared now about the shape of the world. We've got this expansionist Russia. We have the Middle East hitting new heights of instability. We've got the ascent of one of the most powerful, well-funded, and most brutal terrorist groups the world has ever known. We've got the spread of a highly contagious disease, which we now know has shown up in America. We've made remarkable strides in the world toward the elimination of extreme poverty, but we've got a bigger and faster wealth gap growing and the problems that come along with growing income inequality in our own countries. So when you put it all together, one might be forgiven for worrying a little bit about what's going on. And now we've got the stuff in Hong Kong, which is interesting because in view of this tougher expansionist Russia, you have this tougher China. You've got a Chinese administration much tougher than what the world had anticipated. While we were all carrying on about this fantastic maglev trains and the way they build buildings and dams and all that, they're actually getting pretty tough. They're not as bright and shiny and transparent and fun and edgy and cosmopolitan as we were all getting used to them being. So we're watching in Hong Kong. Who's going to blink first? The demonstrators who don't want to give up their freedoms because they've become used to them in Hong Kong, or the Chinese administration, which doesn't broach any dissent back home and can't have the disaffected in mainland China looking at these people in Hong Kong getting away with matters as outrageous as democracy and free speech. Now, I veered away from energy for a moment to make the point that these things do feel like existential threats. They make you feel unsafe. And having a cheap, reliable, and plentiful source of energy, homegrown, as dirty and dangerous as it may be, can feel like a warm hug. And that's the battle over fracking in the United States right now. Society is becoming more and more unequal, and the relevance of that is that the one break that Americans have caught in the last 5 years is the price of energy. The advent of fracking and the cost of natural gas, which is at this point about a third of what Europeans are paying, it's remarkable. It's brought industry back to places that hadn't fired up a mill or a plant in decades. It's made people who can't make ends meet at least be able to pay for their heating. This was a real concern. 6-7 years ago, I remember reporting on it. People getting the heat cut off. It's a great economy right now if you've got a good job and you've got stocks and you've got a house and you've got credit and the availability of capital. But a lot of Americans don't have those things. A lot of Canadians don't have those things either. But a bigger proportion of American society is feeling particularly squeezed. And about the only thing they've got is this low cost of energy. Now, you combine that with the high-paying jobs that we see in North Dakota, very similar to the kinds of thing you see going on in Fort McMurray. In fact, if you looked at these two places from outside, you'd have trouble distinguishing which is which. There, Fort McMurray is a lot more developed, but this is the kind of energy that we see out of natural gas and fracking. Western farmers who are making money they never thought they'd make because suddenly there's a well on their property and they're getting lease money for it. The story becomes compelling. And it might even win the day. I will tell you, though, I sort of thought it would win the day, and I have these discussions about energy, and then I remember that a couple weeks ago I went home and there were 400,000 people in my neighborhood calling for something to be done. It's a complicated issue. It deserves to be complicated. Everybody involved has got to have the full conversation, and that's why I'm honored that you're holding this and that you've invited me and that you keep on having these conversations, because nobody can get away with knowing half the story here. They've got to know the whole story and come to their own conclusions, because people do care about this. So thank you very much.